Episode 5, August 1st to 3rd, 1914. Thunder over Paris by Sir Philip Gibbs. Daily Chronicle correspondent, 1914. Read by Robin Goldsmith. Sir Philip Gibbs, who in the post-war years has endeared himself to an ever-widening circle of readers, was a war correspondent throughout the 4 years of war. He was in Paris at the outbreak, and here describes with his virile pen scenes in the French capital during the period of mobilization. The thunderbolt came out of a blue sky and in the midst of a brilliant sunshine which gleamed blindingly above the white houses of Paris, and flung back shadows from the poplars across the long, straight roads between the fields of France. The children were playing as usual in the garden of the Tuileries, and their white-cat nurses were sewing and chatting in the shade of the scorched trees. The old birdman was still calling, "Viens, viens," to the sparrows who came to perch on his shoulders and peck at the bread between his lips. And Punch was still performing his antique drama in the Petit Guignol to laughing audiences of boys and girls. The bateaux mouches on the Seine were carrying heavy loads of pleasure-seekers to Sèvres and other riverside haunts. In the Pavillon Bleu at Saint-Cloud, elegant little ladies of the demi-monde sipped rose-tinted ices and said for 1,000 times, "Ciel, comme il fait chaud," and slapped the hands of beaky-nosed young men with white slips beneath their waistcoats and shiny boots and other symbols of a high civilization. Americans in Panama hats sauntered down the Rue de Rivoli, staring in the shop windows at the latest studies of nude women, and at night went in pursuit of adventure to Montmartre, where the orchestras at the Bal Tabarin were still fiddling mad tangos in a competition of shrieking melody, and where troops of painted ladies in the Folies Bergère still paraded in the promenoir with languorous eyes through wafts of sickly scent. The little tables were all along the pavements of the boulevards, and the terrasses were crowded with all those bourgeois Frenchmen and their women who do not move out of Paris even in the dog days, but prefer the scenery of their familiar streets to that of Dieppe and Le Touquet. It was the same old Paris, crowded with Cook's tourists and full of the melody of life, as it's played by the hoot of motor horns, the clang of steam trams, the shrill-voiced camelots shouting "La Presse! La Presse!" and of the light laughter of women. Then suddenly the thunderbolt fell with its signal of war, and in a few days Paris was changed, as though by some wizard's spell. Most of the children with their white-capped nurses vanished from the Tuileries gardens, and the sparrows searched in vain for their birdman. Punch gave a final squawk of dismay and disappeared when the theatre of the Petit Guignol was packed up to make way for a more tragic drama. A hush fell on Montmartre, and the musicians in its orchestras packed up their instruments and scurried with scared faces to Berlin, Vienna, and Budapest. No more boats went up to Sèvres and Saint-Cloud with crowds of pleasure-seekers. The Seine was very quiet beneath its bridges, and in the Pavillon Bleu no dainty creatures sat sipping rose-tinted ices, or slapped the hands of beaky-nosed boys who used to pay for them. The women were hiding in their rooms, asking God. Even before the war, they used to ask God funny questions. How they were going to live now that their lovers had gone away to fight, leaving them with nothing but the memory of a last kiss wet with tears. It was not enough to live on for many days. There was no wild outbreak of jingo fever, no demonstrations of bloodlust against Germany in Paris or in any town of France on that first day of August, when the people waited for the fateful decision which, if it were for war, would call every able-bodied man to the colours and arrest all the activities of a nation's normal life, and demand a dreadful sacrifice of blood and tears. There was only a sense of stupefaction, which seemed to numb the intelligence of men so they could not reason with any show of logic, or speak of this menace without incoherence, but thrust back the awful possibility with one word, uttered passionately and repeated 1,000 times a day: incroyable. On August the 1st, there was a run on one of the banks. I passed its doors and saw them besieged by thousands of middle-class men and women, drawn up in a long queue, waiting very quietly, with a strange quietude for any crowd in Paris, to withdraw the savings of a lifetime or the capital of their business houses. There were similar crowds outside other banks, and on the faces of these people there was a look of brooding fear, as though all that they had fought and struggled for, the reward of all their petty economies and meannesses, and shifts and tricks and denials, of self-indulgences and starvings of soul, might suddenly be snatched from them. A shudder went through one such crowd when a young man came to speak to them from the steps of the bank. It was a kind of shuddering sigh, followed by loud murmurings and here and there angry protests. The cashiers had been withdrawn from their desks, and cheques could not be paid. "We're ruined already," said a woman. "This war will take all our money. Oh, my God!" She made her way through the crowd with a fixed, white face. It was strange how, in a day, all gold disappeared from Paris. I could not see the glint of it anywhere, unless I drew it from my own purse. Part of the active army of France was already on the frontiers. Before the first whisper of war had reached the ears of the people, large bodies of troops had been sent to the frontier towns to strengthen the already existing garrisons. But the main army of the nation was pursuing ordinary pursuits of civil life. To resist the might of Germany, the greatest military power in Europe, already approaching the frontiers in vast masses of men and machines, France would have to call out all her manhood, which had been trained in military service. Aux armes, citoyens, formez vos bataillons. The call to arms came without any loud clamour of bugles or orations. Unlike the scenes in the early days of 1870, there were no street processions of civil enthusiasts. No painted beauty of the stage waved the tricolour to the shout of "À Berlin!" No mob orators jumped upon the café tables to wave their arms in defiance of the foe. The quietness of Paris was astounding, and the first mobilization orders were issued with no more publicity than attends the delivery of a trade circular through the halfpenny post. Yet in hundreds of thousands of houses through France, and in all the blocks and tenements of Paris, there was a drama of tragic quietude when the cards were delivered to young men in civilian clothes. Men who sat at table with old mothers or young wives, or in lowly rooms with some dream to keep them company, or with little women who'd spoiled the dream, or fostered it, or with comrades who'd gone on great adventures with them between the Quartier Latin and the mountain of Montmartre. It has come. Fate had come with that little card, summoning each man to join his depot, and tapped him on the shoulder with just a finger touch. It was no more than that, a touch on the shoulder. Yet I know that for many of those young men it seemed a blow between the eyes, and, to some of them, a strange grip as icy cold, as though Death's fingers were already closing round their throats. I seemed to hear the silence in those rooms when, for a moment or two, young men stared at the cards and the formal words on them, and when, for just that time, all that life and death means came before their souls. Was this the summons, death itself? Somewhere on the German side was a little steel bullet or a bit of shell waiting for the Frenchman to whom it was destined. How long would it have to wait to find its billet? Perhaps only a day or two. A question of hours, slipping away now towards eternity as the clock ticked on. From the old mother or the young wife, from the little woman whose emotions and quarrels, greediness or self-denial, had seemed all that mattered in life, all that life meant to a young man of 25 or so, there came perhaps a cry, a name spoken with grief, or no word at all, but the inarticulate expression of foreboding, terror, and a woman's anguish. Jean, mon petit, oh mon pauvre petit. C'est pour la patrie, mon devoir. Je reviendrai bientôt. Courage, ma femme. Courage. How many million times was the word spoken that night of mobilization, by women who saw the sudden pallor of their men, by men who heard the cry of their women. I heard it in the streets, spoken quite brutally sometimes, by men afraid of breaking down, and with a passionate tenderness by other men, sure of their own strength, but pitiful for those whose spirit fainted at the spectre of death, which stood quite close.
Goodbye, goodbye, when the tree may be dear from your eye, though it's hard to part, I know. I'll be till to death, I know. Don't cry, don't sigh, there's a silver lining in the sky. But swallow thick, cheerio, chin-chin, now pull toodle-oo, goodbye. Brother Bert, he went away to do his bit the other day. With a smile on his lips and his lieutenant mix upon his shoulder, bright and gay. As the train moved out, he said, remember me to all the birds, though he wagged his paw and went away to war, shouting out, these my friends.